Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200. I'm your co-host, Jason Lee Guthrie. On today's episode, I talk with Candace Bailey about the musical lives of women in 19th century America, and especially about what the binders volumes that women in Stephen Foster's family used to collect sheet music can tell us about his life and legacy. Candace is a musicologist and John C. Neville Distinguished Professor at North Carolina Central University. Her research explores women in music in the 19th century United States, with a focus on music in the South. Her extensive publication list includes the books Charleston Bells Abroad, the music collections of Harriet Lowndes, Henrietta Aiken, and Louisa Rebecca McCord, and Unbinding Gentility, Women Making Music in the 19th Century South. You are a historian of women's music practices with a focus on the 19th century. Can we start just broadly with some context about what women's music practices were in the 19th century?
Yeah, I like to think about it as how music worked in women's culture. Because people think when they say, oh, you work on women in music, they say, oh, who are the composers? And it's not that I'm focusing on, although there were women composers. A lot of women composed songs, simple dances, miniatures, piano pieces, and that sort of thing. But I'm not so interested in composers as I am the people who consumed music, the people who used it, the people who made it possible for the culture to happen, and how they used it, because without it, we wouldn't have had all this stuff that we have. So those are the people I'm interested in. And it really runs the gamut across society, I have found, from women who did not have a lot of money, did not have a lot of material goods, still would invest some in music. And you can tell that they didn't have a lot because they would save up over generations, save their mother's music, their grandmother's music, whatever, and keep it, to women who had a lot of money to spend on lessons, to spend on going abroad, to go to concerts, to write letters about how I heard so-and-so the other night, to take magazines that had music in them, to collect all sorts of music for themselves and to have it bound in beautiful volumes and so forth. So it runs the gamut. Some women played, as people like to talk about, when they were young women before they got married. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, yeah, and then they put the piano things down after they got married and didn't touch it again, and it was a waste of money. But in reality, that's not usually the case. And a lot of women actually played or sang throughout their lives. They may not have done it as much because they did get busy with children and so on and so forth. But women who spent a lot of time learning to play the piano often were charged with then teaching their children first the rudiments of piano lessons or of singing, occasionally harp or guitar. And then if they wanted to continue, they would then hire teachers if they could afford to do so. A lot of them continued a lot longer than we think they did. One of the women I've worked on was up in the Boston area, and she continued music from the time she was a young girl till right up before she died. She was buying new music every year, performing it with her husband. She never had children, but she kept up with the latest popular music. She sang mostly. So most of her music is vocal. And then there are the women who seemed to buy just mostly things up until they were married or the first couple of years of marriage, and they don't seem to buy much anymore after that. But some of these women did do other ways of supporting music, such as forming local music clubs, supporting music performances, sponsoring music events. Sometimes it was their husbands that were the sponsors of these events, particularly before the Civil War. After the Civil War, we find women taking a much more active role in these types of civic music events. even becoming the officers in local music clubs, which was very unusual. But because of the relative shortage of men, women do start taking on leadership roles, which I find to be very fascinating. They started during the war taking on the leadership roles as far as being the rehearsal conductors. Some of them even became conductors for benefit concerts. Oftentimes it was the chorus or the children's group. They had these concerts where they would have 20 pianos on stage and 2 or 3 girls at each piano, and a woman would be conducting this group. But they were still standing in front of a group in public, waving their arms, keeping the beat so that the people would stay roughly in time. And yet, when you read histories of conductors in the United States, these people didn't exist, according to people who wrote those books. So it's interesting to read these types of women taking on these roles. One place that I've been really surprised at how vibrant they were was in Mobile, Alabama, where there were a lot of events run by a woman named Mariah Kowalewski. And she was an organist who then started taking over the music clubs. And she started programming the summer outing events, programming a lot of instrumental music. She was responsible for rehearsing Faust when the local group put on Faust in the late 1860s, around 1870. She is credited in the paper with rehearsing the ensembles for the production. There was, of course, women in New Orleans who were doing very similar things. And I read where one was referenced as a conductress waving her baton in the early 1870s. Women were doing a lot more than we think they were. And of course, they were teaching. They were giving all kinds of lessons, either in classes or privately, running schools, serving as the music teacher in schools and academies. They were church musicians. They were playing the organ or the piano in churches back into the 18th century, despite what even the most recent book about women musicians will tell you, that you didn't have women organists until Sophie Hewitt. There were women back into the 18th century playing organ in churches for remuneration. So there were quite a bit of opportunities for women to be doing things, plus theater. That's another avenue altogether for women.
Stephen Foster is famously born on July 4th, 1826, which ultimately will lead to the myth of him as the father of American music. He comes on in the late 1840s with O Susanna, and then has a string of a few what we would call today hits and many other songs that were not at quite that level of popularity, but very popular songwriter. And then he will, of course, die just before the Civil War ends. How does Stephen Foster, as the quote-unquote father of American music, fit into women's music practices during the 19th century?
That's a really interesting question, because the reason I started thinking about Stephen Foster is that I had done all this work on women's music, particularly women in the South. That's where I started my focus, being a Southern woman. And it dawned on me after a while that I did not see Stephen Foster in the work that I was looking at. And I did not see much minstrel music. I thought that surely I was going to find these things. Occasionally you would see some of the Foster ballads, but it was not popular. It was not nearly as popular as Franz Zappa's When the Swallows Homeward Fly, which was like the big hit. Or Home Sweet Home, The Last Rose of Summer, which is in a lot of piano and song arrangements. Stephen Foster's not there. He's occasionally in the collections that I look at, but he is not really popular. And when I look at songs from the Civil War period, he again is occasionally there, but not a lot.
Not nearly as much as we are led to believe when we read histories of American music that cite him as this prolific father.
Exactly. And it's only after the Civil War that his music becomes the thing that we know it in the 20th century. I did a little piece on that in a book published a few years ago called Popular Song, edited by Derek Scott. I look at that as a part of that recreation of the myth of the Old South and how Foster plays into that, because I wasn't finding it when I did work up at the Foster Library and I find all these books, of course, it specializes in Foster. So, of course, it's got a lot of Foster's music, particularly the collections owned by the women in the Foster family. But then I went across the street to Carnegie Mellon Library and looked at contemporary volumes owned by women, and they did not have Foster. And then I looked at contemporary programs of recitals and concerts in Pittsburgh. They weren't doing Foster until later, which again leads me to believe that it took some time for his music to really saturate the public idea of American music. And again, I think that's tied to a campaign to really make it, this was the South, even though he was really only there once.
It's interesting because he does experience this unprecedented burst of popularity with Oh Susanna, and then during the 1850s in the lead up to the war, he certainly could have made more use of it by producing more work, being more prolific during the height of public interest in his work. But the most popular work romanticizes the South, romanticizes slavery. He's writing as a Northerner. And then during the Civil War, the North is not interested in music that romanticizes the South anymore. And so he does produce other work. But then the South is also not interested in a Northern composer. So what was initially a market decision, I think, to appeal to as wide of a market as possible when the Civil War happens, he falls through a trapdoor in both ways, which maybe deservedly, but certainly interesting as a historical phenomenon. I do want to make sure we have some time to just talk about the really rich historical sources that you're drawing from. So you mentioned binder's volumes. What is a binder's volume, and how have you used that in your research?
Binder's volumes is a term developed by a U.S. American musicologists, particularly with the publication of Emily's Songbook. It is a collection of printed sheet music, individual sheets of music that are eventually bound together to form a collection. Very often this had a leather or at least leather corners on the outside. It might have the owner's name on a patch put onto the front and printed in, say, gilt, so that you would know who it belonged to. And it was a symbol of the training, the accomplishment of the young lady, because they almost always belong to young women. There are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of these in the United States alone. But of course, Europe, South America, Central America, Australia, New Zealand, all these places, anywhere there was Western music, there were binder's volumes. These are, to my mind, the best representatives of what people were actually doing. Some of them are blank, or not blank, but they don't have any writing in them. Most of them have fingering or pedal marks or breath marks. Some of them will have names written in them. Some of them have friends' names written in them because they gave them each other pieces back and forth. They might have their teacher's name written in them. They might have doodling where they wrote pictures or other comments that they might make about, I saw you the other day. It's almost like they have a little conversation, but they don't want people to hear it. So they write it down on the music so that the people in the room can't know what they're talking about. Or they work like a autograph album. People sign their names at a party on a page of music. They just are a wealth of information that help us learn about a particular time and place where we can say, okay, in this small town or in this little rural area, they were doing this at this particular time. And this is something that people have not had access to or haven't really developed as much as they might have done.
It's difficult history to do. It's very meticulous. It's very tedious. And so when you're wanting to reproduce a story that is just this top level, here was the father of American music, it's as simple as that, and let's move on. You don't necessarily need to get in the weeds like that. But that's what I think is so interesting about your work. So you mentioned there are a very specific set of binder's volumes at the Foster Archives in Pittsburgh. What can we learn from those specifically?
Those are particularly interesting because they are connected directly to Foster and his family. I, for one, did not know about them until I spoke with somebody connected to that library. And at first I thought they were his volumes. And then I got there and found out, well, actually, no, they're not his, but they're connected to the women in his family. They are almost like anthologies of his music, which to me begs the question of then how did they come together? Who brought all this music together? Because as we know, Foster was not necessarily a reliable source for bringing his things together. And they are not all from a single publisher, as some of the writings in the volumes from around the early 20th century would lead you to believe that the publishers provided this music and it's a gift from the publishers. They're from different publishers. So it doesn't all really gel that way. They seem to be different types of collections. Some of them seem to be more directly related to him than others, and teasing out which ones have the closest connections to him, which ones are more like regular binders volumes, and which ones are memorial type collections has been quite fun. It's been a challenge, but it's been fun because we don't have this type of collection for most composers.
What is a major narrative about Stephen Foster and American music that you think we should revise in our understanding?
One thing I feel strongly about, and it's really affected the way I teach music history, is that the music history I was taught does not reflect what was going on in the United States. And since music history seems to be a United States subject, we're the ones who always have all the music history books, textbooks. We should reflect more what people were listening to and playing in the United States at any given time, rather than memorize which great European composer came next. Doesn't mean we won't get to the European composers, because we eventually will, but it's not what was going on, and therefore we should, I think, teach it from the point of view of the consumer in the concert hall. And in doing that, I think we get a different perspective of Stephen Foster and a lot of other American composers, and we would be introduced to more American composers, and we would learn a lot more about American history through American music.
If we come from the bottom up rather than the top down. It's really fascinating. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jenny Lightwise Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.